Welcome to this Day1 conversation. I'm Peter Wallace, and with me today is Diana Butler Bass. Thanks for talking with us, Diana.
Well, thank you for having me, Peter. I really am glad to be with you today.
You mentioned in the book that you trace this history, and focus on some of the people involved and what they did, how they lived it out. Can you give us some highlights, a few highlights of those people, maybe some that you weren't as aware of as you thought, and learned something new about?
Yeah, I learned a lot when I was writing this book, and I took the focus off of institutions and off of doctrinal development or church politics or the big kinds of issues that we usually think of when we think of church history. And then I focused on people, and I asked myself, who are the people throughout the history of the faith who have given us some sort of wisdom about loving God and loving one's neighbor, kind of almost the carriers of the wisdom of the golden rule, as it were. And some of those people are people that would be familiar to folks even with a kind of a cursory interest in history. I do talk about Luther and Calvin and Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. But then I talk about a whole host of sort of middling figures, people who some folks might know, like Hildegard of Bingen or Abelard and Heloise, or, most people know Jonathan Edwards' name, but maybe don't know a whole lot about him. So talk about kind of that group of folks. But then I went as deep as I could go and tried to dig up people even I had never heard of. And I think that some of the people I was most fascinated by there was a group of women in Holland in the 1300s, and they were considered to be followers of the devout life, the devotio moderna. It was the new devotion, and it was a kind of a lay monasticism movement, mostly in the Low Countries. And none of the women that I write about in that section of the book are in any way, shape, or form famous. I never heard of any of them. But what the sisters in this one lay monastery had done is they'd written down their testimonies, and they gathered together this book. And a historian at Notre Dame has written extensively about these testimonies and translated them into English. And I went and I read them, and they were beautiful. One of the sisters was, she might sound a little wacky maybe today, but the people who lived with her talked about her kindness and how she would go into the public square in the little town in which they lived, and she would feed the birds, and she would talk to them, and that she would tell them that she loved them, and she would be kind to these small creatures. And her sisters likened her to Saint Francis. And when I read that testimony about this woman who, in every circumstance in Western history, might remain nameless, it showed me how deep there were these impulses in monasticism, that even this simple Dutch woman would reach back towards Saint Francis and try to emulate the life of poverty, simplicity, and love, and care for nature that he had, and do it in her own life. And so that kind of person I do write about, and try to recover some sense of sacred memory around them. I also write about a couple of slaves, the Reverend Samuel Green, who escaped slavery in Maryland and had a very dramatic story of witnessing to the Christian impulse towards freedom, and I loved his story. And some of the Anabaptist women of the Reformation who willingly gave up their lives for a witness to peace. So there were a lot of people that were inspirational to me.